Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Blood DK in Dragonflight Season 2. I have a bit of a complicated relationship with making Blood DK guides. On the one hand, they're always some of the most popular ones that I make, but on the other, I get so many comments like,
"If you hate Blood DK so much, why do you make videos about it?"
That's right, I did an evil voice. The answer is that I don't hate it, I like it. In preparation for making this video, I started doing Mythic Plus and alt raids on it, and I wasn't thrilled going in like I had been with Demon Hunter. I kept thinking about the bad damage output and the annoying way it handles the start of pulls, and I just wasn't quite as happy as I was with the last couple. But then I did literally one pull in one dungeon, and I was right back in. It felt like slipping into an old, comfortable jacket and finding $20 in the pocket. I played Blood DK a lot in Mythic Plus and in progression rating over the years. I have thousands and thousands of hours of experience on it, and I'm very good at it. I like it, and I'm about to criticize it, but let me say first, it's probably the best tank in the history of the game. For most of the top level raid tanks in WoW, Blood DK is their favorite tank to play in progression rating because it has the most control over its ability to stay alive. It's not my personal favorite, but I do enjoy it, and that level of control is why. Basically, Blood DK is always good, and I've always been clear about the main problem I have with it, which is the amount and type of damage it deals. The damage is bad. There's no point in sugarcoating it, Blood DK damage sucks. There have been some times in the past, such as Shadowlands Season 3, when Blood DK damage was actually pretty good, and that's because at that time their tier set bonuses gave them an absolutely massive increase to uptime on Dancing Rune Weapon and a gargantuan strength buff. But this was nerfed fairly quickly, and outside of that window, Blood DK damage is usually crap. For a more modern example, it's crap right now. Blood DK damage has been buffed, I think about 10 different times this expansion, and it's still at the bottom of the pack. This is caused by the second problem with Blood DK damage. It doesn't really get its damage from a single source. It's spread out across a whole bunch of skills. This all works pretty well defensively, but it causes all of these offensive problems. Every other tank has some kind of clear, powerful AoE damage tool. Paladin has Avenger's Shield and Shield of the Righteous. Brewmaster Monk has Keg Smash. Demon Hunter has Spirit Bomb. Bear Druid has Thrash and Raise. Protection Warrior has Revenge and Thunderclap. Blood has Blood Boil and Death and Decay. The AoE tools are very limited. They could be massively buffed to fix the class's AoE problems, but that wouldn't fix the single target. Death Strike could be buffed to fix the class's single target damage, but that wouldn't fix the AoE. Blizzard could just aura buff all the class's damage spells across the board, except they've already tried that bit by bit about 10 different times in Dragonflight. I was keeping track for a while. I know it had gotten up to at least 8 different aura buffs to Blood DK, or, either specific spells or just generally the class. And eventually I just lost track. It was either 8 or 10, or maybe now it's even 12. It doesn't matter, they're still in last place. This is essentially where my criticism of Blood DK ends. It's not the best tank in high-level Mythic Plus right now, due to being more prone to getting one shot than Bear Druid, having less group utility, and of course not contributing enough damage to the group. But for all but the highest levels of Mythic Plus play, Blood DK is an absolutely amazing tank. Its damage is bad, everything else about the class is good. There is a tendency to say, tank DPS doesn't matter. This is stupid. Bosses do not care where the damage comes from, and by running a DK and losing literally 30,000 DPS compared to a Bear Druid or a Brewmaster Monk, you have to compensate for that damage somewhere else. Can you just tell your Fire Mage, hey, do 30,000 DPS more than you were before? I'm sure they'd love to. This doesn't have a real impact on the overwhelming majority of players. Unless you're in the absolute pinnacle levels of competition, it's not a big deal to sacrifice damage by running a Blood DK tank, and the benefit of having an extremely tanky tank, somebody who's not going to die ever, probably outweighs the downside of that player switching to a tank that could do more damage but might have a higher chance of dying. The choices made by players at the top of the game trickle down to the rest of the community at large, and that includes things like, should my guild run a Blood DK? Well, Liquid didn't, so I guess not. Although Blood DK wasn't that popular at the absolute peak of competition in the last raid tier, it's still extremely popular in the raid. Mainly among the guilds playing slightly below that top level of competition, and this is the exact reason. The players there got comfortable with Blood DK long ago. It's extremely reliable. It can do everything really well. No reason to change. So how does it play? Blood DK is a complex, super defensive tank that has enormous amounts of self-healing, and it is, for the most part, agnostic as to what type of damage is incoming. This means that unlike warriors or monks, who are much stronger at mitigating physical damage than they are magic damage, Blood DK basically treats everything all about the same. Technically, DK has armor, but the real point of DK is that when it takes damage, it uses Death Strike to heal it back up. And the damage type doesn't really matter. Take damage, use Death Strike, stay alive, the end. This means that in general, Blood DK feels a little more sketchy than other tanks on average. Warriors are probably the best example of like a counterpoint to this. Warriors feel super safe and smooth when you're tanking the kind of damage that you're suited toward. Auto attacks, stuff you can block. Then when you go tank something that you can't block, bleed damage, spell damage over time, unreflectable spell damage, it turns into, oh my god, I'm gonna die. Blood DK doesn't have that up and down swing. It's always a little rougher than the best case scenario for other tanks, but it also never really gets much worse than that. It's always pretty manageable. And to that end, DK has several major offensive and defensive buffs it needs to maintain at all times while tanking. One of them is Death and Decay, a ground targeted circle that deals damage over time and gives you increased haste, damage, and healing as long as you stand in it. This makes movement kind of punishing on a DK, particularly when it's in sustained periods of brief bursts of movement. If you have to move around a lot, you will have to move out of your D&D a lot, and it's a pretty powerful buff, so that's not ideal. The other buffs you have to maintain are Icy Talons, which you stack up and keep going by casting Death Strike pretty consistently, at least once every 10 seconds, but really you're going to be casting it quite a bit more often than that. You also have to maintain Bone Shield and Blood Plague. Again, these are pretty easy, but they are a couple more important maintenance buffs. If you like a maintenance buff class, then Blood DK is for you, but if you don't, it's probably not. The other main downside to Blood DK is that it's physically slow. It has great utility in the form of grips, so maybe you don't want to run over to a mob, but you could pull it in. This is really nice for dealing with caster mobs and archer mobs, stuff that stands out at range in Mythic Plus. And it also has the ability to immune lots of magic debuffs and boss mechanics with Anti-Magic Shell. You also have a good group cooldown with Anti-Magic Zone. You have a couple more pieces of group utility as well. For one, you provide an attack speed slow debuff with your auto attacks, which is really powerful in Aberrus since so many of the bosses in there apply dangerous damage over time effects with their auto attacks. But even just if you're dealing with something that auto attacks for a lot of damage, being able to slow that with Blood DK autos is nice. And finally, being able to heal yourself is just really valuable. You have a lot of control over your health pool, more so than any other tank. And this makes your healer's jobs a lot easier. That has ripple effects on the rest of your group. If the healer's not freaking out trying to deal with your health pool, they're able to focus more on healing the rest of the group. People tend to stress out and make mistakes when their health is low, so letting your healer focus more on the group tends to make things easier for everyone. In terms of what Blood DK is good at, it's pretty much everything. They're extremely good at self-healing, obviously, and as long as they don't get one-shot by an attack, they can basically survive absolutely any amount of incoming damage if they play well and manage their resources correctly. You will eventually hit the point where your health pool just kind of pops, but that's true of every tank, and DKs are in really good shape right now from a defensive standpoint. In general, you do more and more self-healing the more damage you take, and your blood shield size is based on the size of the Death Strike heal, so you just have a ton of self-sustain happening pretty much all of the time. You have a big collection of really strong defensive cooldowns too, and the main ones have cooldown reduction effects as well, so you have them available pretty often. Blood DKs also have Gorfien's Grasp, which is the best AoE grip skill in the game, hands down. It's really in a category of its own in terms of controlling enemy mobs. It's super strong for ad fights and raids, or packs in Mythic Plus with a lot of casters or archers in them, and it's totally unique to Blood DK. The only fight in Aberrus where I feel like it's really required is Skarn, but there really is almost no replacement for Gorfien's Grasp. But also, there is sort of one replacement that Blood DK also has. It's Abomination Limb, which deals burst AoE damage over 12 seconds, making it great for the start of Mythic Plus pulls, and it steadily grips enemies into melee range over that time. This makes it really good for situations where you have to move a pack of enemies around an area, or for situations where enemies are just trying to leap out of melee range. You also just have regular Death Grip, which is like very good, way more effective than most of the other displacement skills that are available to tanks and just classes in general. Typhoon knocks a bunch of enemies in a direction not nearly as precise as being able to Death Grip that one pesky ad that's far away right into melee range right now. Blood DK's tier set bonuses are simple, but they add a lot of offensive and defensive value. The 2-piece bonus grants you 20% more damage with Heartstrike and Blood Boil, which helps quite a bit with dealing more AoE damage. You're not going to be tearing it up in AoE, but every bit helps when you're extremely poor, and in AoE damage situations, Blood DK lives below the poverty line. This bonus also gives Heartstrike and Blood Boil a 10% chance to grant Vampiric Blood for 5 seconds. This is per cast, not per enemy hit, so it doesn't scale up in AoE or anything, but it's still a good bonus. The design is good. If you already have Vampiric Blood when this 2-piece procs, it just adds the extra 5-second duration onto the existing Vampiric Blood, and vice versa. It also has great synergy with the 4-piece, which grants you Vampiric Strength whenever you gain Vampiric Blood. This includes from 2-piece procs. Vampiric Strength is a 10% strength buff, and each cast of Heartstrike or Blood Boil while it's active increases its remaining duration by half a second. This is a decent offensive and defensive bonus, but it has a simple problem. I think the straight strength bonuses are the best way to fix Blood DK's damage issues, and by making this a 5-second proc that you can hypothetically extend out to a whopping 7 seconds, but most likely won't get to last more than 5 or 6, it just isn't that great. You want this bonus, you want to wear the 4-piece, it's decent, and it adds stat budget onto a very powerful defensive cooldown, so it's good, but it could have simply just been that Vampiric Blood gives you 10% more strength while it's active, with no other weird time shenanigans going on. This would feel a little better than the current version of the 4-piece, and Blood DK damage would frankly still be pretty low, but it wouldn't be quite so garbaggio. In any case, these are both good bonuses. They reward you for using Vampiric Blood and doing your normal rotation, and that is good. Now let's talk about talents, and I have 2 main talent setups to consider here. Alright, here I have 2 talent setups, a Mythic Plus and a Raid setup. Now, before I even dive into either of these, one of the things that I really like about Blood DK, that I kind of want to just emphasize right off the bat, is how generic the talent setups are. Most of the talents in these 2 setups are the same, not that much changes between the 2 of them, and generally speaking, there is a little bit of wiggle room here and there in these 2 talent setups for just personal preference. Things like, for example, in Mythic Plus, maybe you want to take Anti-Magic Zone if you're playing with coordinated other players and you're doing a dungeon where Anti-Magic Zone would actually be useful, but you can also just drop it and take Acclamation for a minute off of Icebound and Fortitude's cooldown. 2-minute cooldown instead of 3. A little bit of wiggle room here and there, but generally speaking, it's kind of a set template. You play it all the time, you're good to go. When you compare that to like Brewmaster Monk having a single target setup and an AoE setup, and same for like Bear Druid or whatever, doing a boss fight. You're in your boss fight setup, then you have to swap talents to do trash. Then you have to swap back to do the boss. If there are any cooldowns that aren't overlapped between the 2, you're like sitting there waiting for cooldowns to come back up before you can swap talent sets. It's nice to be able to just have one setup that kind of does everything, and Blood DK thankfully has that. So let's emphasize some of the important stuff. I mean, obviously you got to take like Death Strike, you want to take a stamina increase, improve Death Strike, all of these things are pretty much standard. You're going to come down here and take Empower Rune Weapon and a Bomb Limb in every single talent setup you ever use. There doesn't seem to be any reason why you wouldn't. One of the things that is really nice quality of life in here, Death's Echo, and actually does have a good bit of throughput value thanks to just giving you more availability on Death and Decay. It also That second charge of Death's Advance makes it so that you don't really have to spend the points to get Wraithwalk. I can't really think of any situations where you would have needed to pick up Wraithwalk to be able to function in Raid, and you certainly wouldn't need it in Mythic Plus, and that's good because it is so expensive to get down here and get. Basically, this one talent gives you damage output and like healing value through Death and Decay, gives you a lot of utility with 2 charges of Death Grip, and then just completely covers up most of your mobility concerns, which is really good. A lot of value for a single point. And then there's just a lot of value, a lot of like very obvious value just going straight down the right side here of the tree. The only talent here on this right side that's like truly awful is Clenching Grasp. This is clearly PvP stuff. You don't need Death Grip to also slow enemies. Grip of the Dead is probably the main talent that I would swap out for doing non-Mythic Plus, like switching to Raid. You don't need to be able to D&D slow most of the time, but there are situations where it's really nice. All right, now let's take a look at the right-hand tree, and again, you're kind of forced into this set of talents at the top. That's every talent tree, so it's fine. They're all pretty good value. Crimson Scourge adds a lot of rotational value. Vampiric Blood, main defensive cooldown. Where you have some wiggle room is whether or not you take Rune Tap. This is very commonly taken in Mythic Plus and less so in Raid. It's possible to play without Rune Tap at all, but it is really nice to have that short cooldown, low value defensive cooldown that you can use, pretty consistently to deal with just like a mob does, tank strike 1. You can press Rune Tap and give yourself enough defenses to be able to live through it and Death Strike back up without having to commit a real major cooldown to living through that. And that is nice. The only real thing that I would take instead of Rune Tap would probably, in Mythic Plus, be Hemostasis. And then the rest of the tree I would keep pretty much the same. Now you'll note that you don't take Gorfine's Grasp, and that's because, unfortunately, you don't need it for pathing. And, I would prefer to have it in Mythic Plus. I really do like having Gorfine's Grasp, but the only way to get it is either to give up a massive damage talent in the form of Shattering Bone, or to give up Purgatory, or to give up Ironheart, which is a great defensive talent, or to give up Umbilicus Eternus, which is a great defensive talent. So you've got this incredible defensive lifeline, this incredible defensive talent, this incredible defensive talent, and this amazing offensive talent. And compared to all of those, the occasional value of Gorfine's Grasp is just not good enough. Other than that, most of these talents that are selected in this setup are pretty much locked in. You're gonna take Dancing Rune Weapon and everything that supports it. It would be foolish not to. Getting a 1% max health increase from each charge of Bone Shield is incredible value for a single point. We're talking 6 to 10% more health on a class that scales its defenses based on its health. That's insane. 10% more haste on a class that values haste. That's insane. So lots of really good stuff here. Bone Storm and Bloodshot are both talents that I don't take, and most people at higher levels of play don't take. The main reason for Bone Storm is just simply it doesn't really do enough damage and healing right now to account for the loss of runic power, the amount of runic power it consumes. It just hasn't been scaled up enough to really compete with Death Strike as like an overall value talent. And the reason you don't take Bloodshot is basically, it's not a great damage increase, it's a damage increase. It's just not that good. You can take it if you're doing trivial content. You would just drop Umbilicus Eternus, take Bloodshot, boom, there you go, easy as pie. But that's pretty much only for like, if you're speeding through stuff that you overgear, that's the swap I would make. Additionally, Heartrend, one of the worst talents around. It's a 12% chance for casting Heart Strike to make your next Death Strike do 20% more damage. Just god awful. Truly a wretched talent. The problem is that it's above Purgatory, which is great. If you don't need Purg, the same situation where you would take Umbilicus Eternus out and pick up Bloodshot, you could drop Heartrend, and you could potentially pick up like Bone Storm and Gorfine's Grasp, give yourself a little bit more damage, a little bit more utility, or you could do this, take all of these 3 other non-Purg capstones, but you are playing with fire. You're driving with your seatbelt off, basically, by not playing with Purg. Now let's take a look at the raid build. It's going to look pretty similar. Over here in the left-hand tree, you are dropping Blinding Sleet, which is a great AoE crowd control tool. Usually worthless in raid to have crowd control tools. In most cases, you aren't taking Asphyxiate, just on the subject of crowd control. You can pick it up. You can drop, say, this point over here in Unholy Bond, which just gives you a little bit more damage and a little bit more healing from your Fallen Crusader procs. It's not really that great, but it is sort of the best remaining talent point option, just generically. If you needed a stun in raid, you could take Asphyxiate. If you needed a little bit more group defensive value, you could take Assimilation. You could take March of Darkness if you need a little bit more speed for something, or Grip of the Dead if you need to slow ads on Skarn, for example. Definitely nice to have a little bit of 1 point worth of talent wiggle room. I think the most commonly used next talent point would just be Acclamation for a little bit more availability on Icebound Fortitude. I've never really found that talent to be all that great, but it's an option. It's probably the thing people use the most. In the right-hand tree, you'll note that we dropped Improved Vampiric Blood, and that's generally just because staying alive on a Blood DK in raid, you don't really need that extra amount of healing and duration on Vamp Blood. If you're struggling at all with your defenses, I would take it instead of Improved Heartstrike. Improved Heartstrike's a pretty big damage increase to Heartstrike. That's why you're taking Improved Heartstrike in raid instead of Improved Vampiric Blood. But overall, it's not actually that much of a total damage increase. And, you know, if you need Vamp Blood to live, you should definitely take it. Kind of something that you have to feel out and get a feel, just get a feel for based on your experiences in raid. In the bottom half of the tree, things look mostly the same. You'll note that we didn't take Rune Tap for raid. That's generally going to be the case. I would say most fights you don't really need that on-demand defensive cooldown from Rune Tap. Maybe Neltharion would be the one situation. Neltharion and Sarkareth, I could see using Rune Tap just to mitigate their main strikes, along with something else. In the case of Sarkareth, I would use like Anti-Magic Shell and Rune Tap to mitigate the Void Slashes and Void Claws. Maybe that would be an option, but you will get a lot more damage out of Hemostasis. And in raids, damage is a little bit higher priority than that very, very mediocre defensive cooldown. You'll note that a big change that happens down here in the bottom half of the tree is dropping Umbilicus Eternus, and this is because Umbilicus Eternus scales specifically with the Blood Plague damage that you do during Vampiric Blood, and Blood Plague is the dot that you apply to everything, so it's really not very good in single target. This gives you basically 2 free points to move around. You're putting 1 into Bloodshot for more single target damage, more damage from Death Strike, more damage from your auto attacks, so that's pretty nice. And then that leaves 1 other talent just kind of floating around. You could put that second point into Red Thirst for more availability of Vampiric Blood, more uptime on your 4-piece bonus, but in terms of damage contribution, you actually get less damage from that second point in Red Thirst than you do from just running Bloodworms. And Bloodworms are a decent little, proc heal that occurs when you drop low. As you can read from the tooltip, they heal you for 15% of your missing health, and if you drop below half health, they will immediately burst and heal you. So that means they would hit you for, if you're at half health, 7.5% of your health. It's not great. It's certainly not a health pot, not a death strike, but it's not nothing. And it is a damage contribution that's going to add up to more than the second point in Red Thirst. So really, either of these two options is fine. 2 points in Red Thirst is a lot more defensive. And if you were going to do both points in Red Thirst, I would probably just go ahead and take Improved Vampiric Blood and basically run pretty much the same setup as you would in Mythic Plus, except maybe I wouldn't run Umbilicus Eternus. And then for any situation where you need Gorfien's Grasp, so we're talking Skarn mostly, basically just Skarn, I would run Gorfien's Grasp. No point in Bloodshot. It's not required. It's not an amazing damage increase by any stretch, and even if it was, it's amazing on the sliding scale that comes with being a blood DK. So, the richest poor person in the world. I don't even know how you would quantify that. Not good, that's how. Alright, that's it. Now let's move on to abilities. Blood DK is a bit different from every other tank and really every other class in the game. It's built around maintaining a bunch of different buffs and managing 2 different resources. The buff management, the plate spinning, that's not totally unique, but having 2 different resources on top of that definitely is. I would say that compared to Brewmaster Monk, it's not the most complex tank in the game, and really it's not that close anymore, but it is the closest of the other 5 tanks to Brewmaster Monk in terms of max complexity. You have 6 runes, which have a 10-second base recharge that's reduced by haste. You use runes to cast most of your skills, and spending runes grants 10 runic power per rune. You use runic power primarily just to cast Death Strike. You can only recharge 3 runes at a time, so that means if you spend 4 runes, 1 will be waiting behind the other 3 to start its cooldown. This is fine. There's nothing wrong with blowing through all 6 of your runes, you just always want to have at least 3 cooling down at any given time, because any rune that's not actively cooling down is wasted resource generation. And wasting resource generation is what gets DKs killed. You want to maximize the value of your runes by keeping them on cooldown, but also never cap on runic power. You also need to maintain Bone Shield at the same time, as well as the Death and Decay buff, the Icy Talons buff, and Blood Plague. This creates a back and forth where you're spending runes on some spells, then Death Striking to spend runic power, spending runes on other spells, Death Striking to spend runic power, more runes or maybe Blood Boil, more Death Strike, and so on, back and forth. In general, you want to maintain Bone Shield at all times. The maximum number of Bone Shield charges is 10, and you always want to maintain at least 5. Death's Caress and Marrow Rend both generate Bone Shield charges. Death's Caress costs 1 rune and generates 2 charges, Marrow Rend costs 2 runes and generates 3. This means Death's Caress is significantly more efficient, but Marrow Rend deals substantially more damage, so most of the time it is the better option for maintaining Bone Shield. If you don't have enough runes, or if you're forced out of melee range, Death's Caress is still useful. It's also very useful on pulls, because you're not in melee range at the start of a pull. If you have Dancing Rune Weapon active, Marrow Rend will hit 3 times. This gives you 9 Bone Shield charges for a single cast, so that's pretty good, and you can use that to get a huge boost of Bone Shield charges if you need. Similarly, Death's Caress will hit 3 times during Dancing Rune Weapon, so that would grant you 6 Bone Shield charges, and it's a pretty great way to keep your Bone Shield charges capped up for very cheap during your cooldowns, and then that way you can deal more damage and generate more runic power during that Dancing Rune Weapon window by using Heart Strike. Okay, so Bone Shield maintenance is covered. Now you want to maintain Icy Talons, and the way you do that is to cast Death Strike every 10 seconds. You may have to use it more often than that to heal yourself during normal damage periods. Frankly, you will probably be hitting Death Strike more like every 5 seconds, but you should at an absolute maximum use it every 10 seconds. You should also use it whenever you're about to cap on runic power, and this is probably the main limiter more than that 10-second window. Of course, you should also use it whenever you need healing. Duh. Alright, so now we're kind of at the point of never let Bone Shield fall off, use Death Strike to heal. Those are the backbone of playing Blood DK. They're the whole skeleton. The rest of your kit exists to let Death Strike work its magic, or to provide secondary utility. You know, Death Grip, defensive cooldowns. Bone Shield exists to keep you alive long enough to cast Death Strike. Everything else is really just about making it heal for more or letting you cast it more. Death Strike is what defines Blood DK. Next on your list of priorities, you want to maintain Death and Decay at all times. It's pretty simple, you cast it where you're standing. If you need to move, then you can either cast it where you're going, or you can wait until you've stopped moving and then recast it there. When it fades, you want to refresh it as quickly as you can. That's pretty much it. Okay, now we can get down to the filler skills, and those are actually the things that you're going to be using, maybe not more than everything else on the list, but you're going to be using them a lot. Once you have all the other boxes on the list checked off, so we're talking Bone Shield's up, you're using Death Strike, you're not capping resources of any kind, and you're keeping Death and Decay down. At that point, you can use Heart Strike to keep your runes on cooldown and generate runic power. It generates an extra 5 runic power by default, potentially even more with some talent setups, but that isn't as popular at this moment. Finally, Blood Boil is your filler skill of last resort, and it's a very simple AoE damage skill that's useful for picking up threat at the start of pulls. Keeping Blood Plague up is by far the easiest of your mini maintenance buffs, but it does add a bunch of extra damage and healing. Basically, you just use Blood Boil, it's free, it does AoE damage, that's it. Now let's talk about cooldowns. You have Abomination Limb, Empower Rune Weapon, and Dancing Rune Weapon. These are the main three. A-Bomb Limb and ERW are both resource generators and offensive cooldowns. A-Bomb Limb generates Bone Shield charges, grips nearby enemies toward you, of course, and deals a lot of AoE damage. It's a really good skill unless you're holding it to grip enemies toward you at a specific time. You probably want to use it on cooldown most of the time. Empower Rune Weapon gives you a ton of resource generation and a big haste buff. You really want to use this on cooldown as well, and ideally you'll layer it right on top of Empower Rune Weapon. It's off the global cooldown, so using them at the same time is easy, and normally that is how you want to approach it. It's okay if this restores some runes at the start of a pull when you're still getting your runes on cooldown, that's completely fine. Having this synced up with A-Bomb Limb and your ghoul is more important than getting every single possible rune out of it. You really just want to use Empower Rune Weapon as much as you can. You don't want to sit on this on cooldown until you're out of runes. That is the wrong way to use it. Fire it on cooldown unless a pull is about to end or you're coming up to like an immunity intermission phase in raid or something that would constitute a break in combat. Raise Dead is actually a meaningful defensive cooldown now. Your ghoul is pretty basic. You summon him, he auto-attacks enemies, and thanks to talents, sometimes those auto-attacks make them deal less damage to you. That's pretty much it, but it's good and it's off the global cooldown, the Ghoulable cooldown, so you should use him basically on cooldown as well. You have Dancing Rune Weapon. This is a mix of an offensive and defensive cooldown. It gives you a bunch of parry chance, and with the standard talent setup, you summon 2 copies of your Dancing Rune Weapon that deal an extra 33% of your damage, and copy all of your spell casts. Some of this works really well, such as Marrowrend and Death's Caress giving you triple Bone Shield charges, or your Blood Plagues tripling and copying and so on to all enemies and doing a bunch of extra damage. This is great. The threat your weapons generate also carries over to you, so it's a really good skill for maximizing your threat at the start of pulls. There are some stupid components to this skill too, though. For example, Death Strike. When you Death Strike while Dancing Rune Weapon is active, you do damage and heal yourself, and your Dancing Rune Weapons also do damage and also heal themselves, and they're swords. It's just kind of stupid. The healing doesn't go to you, it goes to them. You can see it happening around you. Whatever. Because of this amazing cluster of talents in the central line of the Blood Talent tree, you get to use Dancing Rune Weapon really often. It's like a 1 minute cooldown or less, and it is a major cooldown. It adds a lot of damage, it adds a ton of tankiness, and it's just really, really powerful. So you want to maximize its value as much as you possibly can. Basically, this means that the only time I wouldn't pop it on cooldown is if I'm not actively tanking during a taunt swap raid boss fight, or if a pull is about to end in a Mythic Plus dungeon. But other than that, I would use it at the start of pulls, as it comes up during pulls that are going to clearly last for a while, or as soon as I'm about to taunt in raid. Now I want to talk about Tombstone. Tombstone is part of the reason why Dancing Rune Weapon has such good uptime. It's a 1 minute cooldown that consumes 5 Bone Shield charges, generates a lot of runic power, and gives you a shield worth 30% of your maximum health. The way you use Tombstone is pretty straightforward. You want to use it on cooldown as much as you can, but with 3 caveats. So here's the list of things you want to be sure of before you cast Tombstone. 1. Make sure Dancing Rune Weapon is on cooldown, and make sure that you'll get the full cooldown reduction from Tombstone by using it. You're going to get 25 seconds of cooldown reduction when you press Tombstone, so you want Dancing Rune Weapon to be at least 25 seconds or more from coming back up. If it is closer than that, 10, 15 seconds away, I would wait for it to come back up naturally, then use Tombstone immediately afterward. 2. You should always have at least 6 Bone Shield charges up. You want to consume 5, so you need at least 5, but you don't want to consume all of them and have none and instantly die, so getting to 6 or more is just a good idea. At that point, you can then Tombstone down to a lower number and then immediately reach in more Bone Shield charges. And third, be sure you're standing in Death and Decay. This is critically important. Being in Death and Decay triples the damage of your Shattering Bone, which is a really valuable damage talent that you should be using. Using Tombstone counts as 5 hits of Shattering Bone, so you want all of those to deal triple damage. You want to do 15 hits worth of damage, not 5. Next you have Icebound Fortitude and Lichborn, both of which are pretty basic damage reduction cooldowns, although they can be used to break out of crowd controls. Icebound Fortitude makes you immune to stuns. Lichborn makes you immune to fear, sleep, and mind control. Generally, you just use them like a normal damage reduction cooldown. You press them before you're about to take the damage, not after, and then you take less damage. Because they are crowd control breaks, you can use them reactively to break out of crowd control effects. This is all pretty straightforward. Anti-Magic Shell is similar. It's an absorb shield against magic damage, and it prevents magic debuffs from being applied to you. This is somewhat inconsistent about making you immune to debuffs in Raid and Mythic Plus. It's a good defensive cooldown either way, but it can range from a bit of damage reduction, but the boss still debuffs me, to completely overpowered, totally changes the way you do a fight by making you immune to a really critical boss mechanic. The last two cooldowns are Vampiric Blood and Rune Tap. Rune Tap is a talent and its value can be a bit inconsistent. It provides a fairly minor defensive boost, but it's on a fairly short cooldown. It basically competes with Heartstrike for sort of secondary rune usage, which makes it a little questionable in some situations, but it is a reliable source of damage reduction if you really need another defensive cooldown, so it's okay. Vampiric Blood, on the other hand, is an amazing defensive cooldown, and thanks to the current tier set bonuses, it's a decent offensive cooldown as well. It gives you a bunch of extra health and makes you take more healing. This is super strong, and due to Red Thirst, the cooldown is extremely short. If you run Umbilicus Eternus, which is really nice in Mythic Plus, it also gives you a huge shield when Vampiric Blood expires. So it's great as a proactive cooldown for making your health pool bigger to survive huge boss hits. It's great as a reactive cooldown when your health unexpectedly drops low so you can Death Strike yourself back to safety. And it's good as a mitigation cooldown in those AoE situations where it just gives you a big ol' shield. It's really, really strong. Now let's go over how to pull on a Blood DK. This is something I always go over specifically because I know that pulling packs of mobs in dungeons can be kind of challenging for newer players. So here we are. Opening up by hitting Death and Decay, and getting that down under a pack of enemies is really important. If you're using Grip of the Dead, this has the added effect of keeping enemies super slow, basically rooted in place by the Death and Decay. You also want to get Bone Shield charges up and running before you get auto-attacked, so casting Death's Caress from range, then Death and Decay immediately afterward is a good approach. You can do it in either direction. Death and Decay first to keep them slow, Death's Caress as you're walking into melee range. After that, you want to pop your collection of cooldowns. Dancing Rune Weapon, A-Bomb Limb, Raise Ghoul, and Empower Rune Weapon. Then you'll Blood Boil to tag all the enemies in the pack and establish threat and dominance. Then use Tombstone to get it on cooldown, start using Death Strike, Heart Strike, and so on, and proceed to your main rotation from there. If you don't have cooldowns available, holding threat in AoE is more difficult. The way you want to deal with this is by relying on the tools you have. So we're talking Blood Boil and Death and Decay. These really do a lot of heavy lifting in AoE. Targeting enemies that you're losing threat on and Death Striking them specifically helps a lot. But I think most importantly, a simple Death Grip on an enemy who's running at a healer or a ranged cleans up a messy pull very quickly. Death Grip is a taunt, and so you have Dark Command as your taunt, then Death Grip as a taunt, and then a second charge on Death Grip also as a taunt. No other tank has 3 taunts. You're usually in pretty good shape, even if you don't have all your cooldowns available. But when you do, it's actually pretty easy to hold threat in AoE on a Blood DK now. It's certainly a lot easier than it has been in previous iterations. In terms of stats, Strength is the most important stat to DK. Whenever possible, you want to maximize your item level. If you're comparing items that are at the same item level, Haste is the best, and the rest are, the rest. You want to enchant Gem for Haste, and then your second best secondary stat is dependent on the rest of your gear. I really wouldn't worry about it. Gem-wise, I would usually do Haste Verse gems. I prefer Verse as the secondary stat. It provides the most consistent all-around damage mitigation, and it adds some damage. Some Blood DKs in high level keys will use Haste Mastery for a little bit of reliable damage mitigation against like physical damage specifically through Blood Shield. And Haste Crit has seen usage at times throughout DK's history because it's a bit better for damage output and provides good overall damage reduction against auto attacks, but it is pretty inconsistent because it's reliant on parry to do anything defensively. Again, max item level, that's the most important thing, then haste, then whatever. I like speed enchants on bracers, wrists, and boots. They really do help compensate for how slow you are, but avoidance and stamina enchants are also fine. Finally, be sure to use Fallen Crusader as your weapon enchant. The alternatives are nowhere close to its value. Okay, that's Blood DK. It's a really strong tank, and I had a lot of fun making this video about how to play them. I'm hopeful that the third season of Dragonflight can provide DKs with a tier set bonus that'll compensate for their offensive weaknesses, but even if that doesn't happen, there's still going to be a strong tank option going forward. They have unique group utility in the form of grips, they are extremely tanky, and they are very self-sufficient. What more could you ask for from a tank? Damage, obviously, but then the class would just be overpowered and it would be all anybody plays. You know, probably. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.